Welcome to Soft Mystic Stories. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. Tonight we're stepping far back into the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, back to a time when life was shaped by narrow cobblestone streets, wooden houses crowded together, and the constant rhythm of church bells marking the hours. In that world, something very odd began to unfold under the warm July sun. A single woman stepped into the open space near the market square and started to dance. She did not stop, not for hours, not even when night came. Her feet moved without rest, her body swaying as if pulled by invisible strings. Neighbors gathered to watch, some laughing at first, others frowning in confusion. By the next morning, a few more had joined her, their movements equally tireless and uncontrolled. Within days, the numbers grew into the dozens, then far beyond. People from all walks of life found themselves unable to sit still. They danced through the streets, through the markets, even inside homes. Some collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again and keep moving. Others fell and did not get up. The city council met in urgent sessions. Physicians examined the dancers. Priests offered prayers. Nothing seemed to halt the strange compulsion. This event would later be called the Dancing Plague of 1518. One of the most puzzling episodes in the records of the 1500s. It happened in a corner of the Holy Roman Empire, a loose collection of cities, principalities, and territories that stretched across much of Central Europe. Strasbourg itself sat along the Rhine River, a busy trading hub, with strong walls, busy docks, and a large cathedral that dominated the skyline. The year 1518 brought its own troubles. Poor harvests in the years just before had left many families short of bread, while rumors of new taxes and distant political quarrels added to the unease. Yet nothing prepared the residents for what began that July. The dancing continued for weeks, drawing the attention of chroniclers who wrote down what they saw with a mixture of wonder and worry. Modern readers sometimes smile at the story, but for those who lived through it, the sight of friends and family members trapped in endless motion was deeply disturbing. It raised questions about the human body, about the mind, and about forces that no one at the time could fully explain. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere special tonight, feel free to share your location and the local time in the comments. It always brings a quiet smile to know where everyone is settling in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin. In the middle of that summer, the air in Strasbourg carried the usual mix of wood smoke, river damp, and the faint scent of baking bread from the communal ovens. Most days passed with the steady pace of craft work, market trading, and the routines of family life. Children played in the alleys, apprentices carried tools for their masters, and merchants argued over the price of grain or cloth. The city was home to roughly 25,000 souls, a sizable population for the period, protected by thick stone walls and guarded gates that closed at sunset. Life moved according to the seasons and the church calendar, with festivals providing rare breaks from daily labor. Yet beneath the surface, many felt the strain of recent hardships. Floods and cold winters are damaged crops, making bread more expensive and thinner than usual. Some families stretched their meals with cheaper grains or foraged greens. The threat of illness always lingered, from the common fevers that swept through crowded quarters to the more frightening outbreaks that arrived without warning. Into this setting stepped Fra Truffia, a woman whose name would be remembered long after the event itself faded from living memory. On or around the 7th day of July, she came out of her house and began to dance in the street. Her movements were not joyful or rhythmic in any familiar way. They were repetitive, almost mechanical, as though her legs refused to obey any command except to keep stepping and turning. She wore the simple dress of a burgher's wife, perhaps with an apron still tied at the waist, and her hair was likely bound under a linen cap. Passers-by paused to stare. A few called out to her, asking what she was doing. She gave no answer. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and still she danced. By evening her face showed strain, sweat running down her cheeks. Yet her feet continued their steady motion. Neighbors brought water and tried to make her sit, but she pulled away and kept going. When darkness fell, torches were lit so people could see. Some whispered that she must be possessed or cursed. Others suggested she had lost her mind. A small crowd stayed to watch through the night, their own fatigue growing while hers seemed endless. The next morning, a second person joined her. Then a third. By the end of the second day, the group had grown to more than a dozen. They moved together now, forming loose circles or lines that wound through the square. Their steps varied, some high and kicking, others shuffling or stomping, but none could stop for long. When one dancer stumbled and fell, others helped them up or simply danced around the fallen figure until strength returned. City officials arrived to observe. They noted the names of those involved and tried to speak with them, but most dancers were too caught up in their movements to reply clearly. Word spread quickly through the narrow lanes and across the river to the smaller settlements nearby. Farmers coming into market for the day heard the story and carried it back to their villages. Within a week, the number of dancers had climbed past 30, then 50. The phenomenon no longer seemed like the private trouble of one woman. It had become a public concern that touched every part of the city. Physicians were summoned from the local guild. They examined the dancers for signs of fever, swelling, or injury. Some checked the pulse, others looked at the eyes or the color of the tongue. The results were puzzling. Most of the dancers showed no obvious illness beyond extreme tiredness and bruised feet. A few had bleeding from blisters that had formed on their soles. Yet, they continued to move. The council debated what to do. Some members suggested isolating the dancers in a quiet building where they could rest. Others worried that forcing them to stop might cause even greater harm. In the end, a decision was reached that reflected the thinking of the time. Rather than fight the urge to dance, the authorities would provide space and music to let the compulsion run its course. A wooden stage was quickly built in the square, and musicians were hired to play pipes, drums, and fiddles. The idea was that structured music might help the dancers tire themselves out faster, or perhaps bring the episode to a natural close. Instead, the sound of the instrument seemed to draw even more people into the circle. The dancing grew louder and more chaotic as the days passed. The scene in the market square took on a surreal quality. Dancers moved from dawn until well after dark, their numbers swelling to over 100 at times. Some wore the plain clothes of laborers, others the finer garments of merchants' families. Men and women danced side by side, young and old together. Children sometimes joined for short periods, before being pulled away by worried parents. The air filled with the steady beat of drums and the thin wail of flutes, mixed with the sounds of heavy breathing and the occasional cry when someone collapsed. City guards kept order as best they could, making sure the dancers did not wander into the river or block the main gates. Food and drink were offered at intervals, though many dancers were too exhausted to eat much. The spectacle attracted visitors from surrounding towns, some coming out of curiosity, others to pray or offer help. Chroniclers later recorded that the outbreak lasted roughly 4 to 6 weeks, though exact dates varied slightly in different accounts. By late August, the last of the dancers had finally stopped. Many recovered slowly, their bodies marked by fatigue and sore limbs. A smaller number did not survive. The event left a deep impression on the city, one that would be discussed in letters, town records, and medical treatises for years afterward. The summer of 1518 was not the first time Europe had seen groups of people overtaken by uncontrollable dancing. Similar episodes had occurred in the 1300s and early 1400s, in places like the Low Countries and along the Rhine. Yet the Strasbourg case stood out because of its size, its duration, and the careful records kept by local officials. It also happened at a moment when the continent stood on the edge of larger changes. The printing press was spreading new ideas rapidly. Reformers were beginning to question long-held church practices. Distant voyages were bringing news of unknown lands and peoples. In the midst of these shifts, the dancing plague appeared almost like a reminder of older mysteries, forces that science and faith alike struggled to contain. For the people of Strasbourg, the episode was both frightening and strangely human. It showed how quickly everyday life could tilt into the inexplicable, and how communities, responded when faced with something no one could fully explain. As the dancers finally rested, and the music fell silent, the city turned its attention back to the harvest, the markets, and the ordinary concerns that filled most days. Yet the memory of that summer lingered, passed down in stories told by firelight, or recorded in the neat handwriting of town scribes. The first steps. The first person to begin dancing that July was a local woman known in the records as Fra Truff. She lived in one of the modest timber-framed houses along a side street not far from the cathedral. On the morning of July 7, she walked out of her door and simply started moving her feet in a steady, repetitive pattern. There was no music at first, no crowd, and no obvious reason. She lifted one foot after the other, turning slowly in place, her arms sometimes swinging loosely at her sides. Neighbors who saw her assumed at the beginning that she might be practicing steps for an upcoming festival, or perhaps working off some private worry. But as the hours stretched on, and she showed no sign of stopping, concern replaced curiosity. A shopkeeper across the lane set down his tools and watched for a long while. A woman carrying a basket of laundry paused, then called out to ask if everything was all right. Fra Truff did not answer. Her eyes stayed focused somewhere ahead, and her breathing grew heavier as the sun climbed. By midday, a small knot of people had gathered. Someone brought a stool and tried to guide her toward it, but she stepped around the obstacle and kept going. Another offered water in a wooden cup. She drank a little without breaking stride. The afternoon heat made the scene more uncomfortable. Sweat soaked through her linen dress, and dust from the unpaved street clung to her shoes. Still the motion continued. When evening arrived, torches were lit along the lane so the watchers could see clearly. A few men discussed carrying her inside by force, but they hesitated, worried that sudden restraint might cause injury. Instead, they stayed nearby through the night, taking turns to rest on nearby benches. By morning her face looked drawn, and her steps had become slightly unsteady. Yet she persisted. On the second day, the first additional dancers appeared. A young man who worked as a carpenter joined her in the same open area. He had been among the onlookers the previous evening. Without any warning, he dropped the plank he was carrying and began to move in a similar restless pattern. Soon after, a middle-aged woman from a nearby household stepped out and started dancing beside them. The group now numbered 3, their movements overlapping but not coordinated. The carpenter's heavy boots thudded against the ground, while the women's lighter steps created a softer rhythm. Word traveled quickly along the street. By late afternoon, 2 more had joined, both servants from different houses. The authorities were notified, and a pair of council guards arrived to observe and report back. The reactions around them varied in quiet ways. Some neighbors shook their heads and muttered about witchcraft or bad air. Others brought small offerings of bread or ale, hoping the dancers might pause long enough to accept them. Children peeked from doorways, wide-eyed but kept at a safe distance by anxious parents. A local priest stopped by, made the sign of the cross, and spoke a short prayer before continuing on his rounds. No one yet understood this as the start of something larger. It still looked like the private affliction of a few individuals. As the third day unfolded, the number reached 7. They had moved from the narrow lane into a wider space near the market square, where there was more room. Their dancing now created visible wear on the ground, with scuffed patches showing where feet had passed again and again. One dancer, an older man, began to show signs of severe fatigue. His knees buckled several times, but each time he rose and resumed the motion. A physician from the guild was called in the late morning. He examined the group one by one, while they continued moving. He felt pulses, looked at tongues, and asked simple questions. The answers were brief, and sometimes mumbled between breaths. No clear fever was found, no obvious swelling or rash. The doctor left puzzled, promising to consult with colleagues. That evening, the city council held its first formal discussion on the matter. The meeting took place in the council chamber, a stone room lit by candles and warmed by a small hearth. Members listened to reports from the guards and the physician. One councillor suggested the dancers might be suffering from a form of melancholy that had turned outward. Another wondered aloud if tainted bread was to blame, recalling past incidents where spoiled grain had caused strange behaviors in other towns. No decision was reached beyond continued observation. Meanwhile, in the square, the dancers kept going under lantern light. Their numbers had grown to 11 by midnight. A quirky detail from those early hours was that one of the dancers, a baker's apprentice, somehow managed to keep a small loaf of bread tucked under his arm the entire time. He never ate it, never dropped it, just carried it along as he turned and stepped, as if the bread were part of the unexplained routine. By the end of the first week, the group had expanded beyond 20. They formed loose clusters that shifted positions slowly across the square. Some dancers sang fragments of familiar hymns or folk tunes between labored breaths, though the words were often slurred. Others remained completely silent, their faces showing concentration mixed with visible strain. The city's daily routines began to adjust around them. Market stalls were moved to the edges to leave space. Delivery carts took longer routes to avoid the area. Families sent younger children to stay with relatives outside the city walls for a few days as a precaution. Fra Trofa herself remained at the center of the activity for many days. She was not the strongest dancer nor the most vocal, but her persistence set the pattern that others followed. At one point, she stumbled badly and lay on the ground for nearly an hour. Helpers covered her with a cloak and offered sips of watered wine. When she finally stood again, the dancing resumed as before. Her endurance became a quiet topic of conversation among the watchers. Some saw it as evidence of supernatural influence. Others simply marveled at the limits of the human body under duress. The initial steps of the plague revealed how quickly something unusual could disrupt the ordinary flow of urban life in the 1500s. What began as one woman's solitary movement in a side street had within days drawn the attention of physicians, priests, and city leaders. The dancers themselves showed no uniform symptoms beyond the compulsion to keep moving. Their social backgrounds differed: servants, craftsmen, housewives, and at least one minor merchant. No single trade or neighborhood seemed especially affected at first. The episode was still small enough that many residents hoped it would burn itself out, naturally, like a summer fever that passes after a few uncomfortable days. Yet, the steady increase in numbers suggested otherwise. Each new dancer added weight to the growing sense that something beyond normal explanation was at work. The streets around the square took on a different atmosphere, part concern, part reluctant fascination. Torches burned later into the night than usual. Conversations in taverns turned repeatedly to the same topic, and the dancers continued, their feet tracing endless patterns on the worn earth, while the rest of the city watched, waited, and wondered what would come next. The spread. As the second week of July began, the number of dancers in the square climbed steadily past 30, and then 50. What had started in a single side street now occupied a larger portion of the market area, with people moving in shifting clusters that sometimes collided and then separated again. New participants joined at irregular intervals throughout the day. A woman carrying vegetables from a garden plot set down her basket and stepped into the group, without a word. A blacksmith's assistant left his forge mid-taskwy, still wearing his heavy leather apron, and began to move, among the others. The additions came from different parts of the city: the riverfront warehouses, the craft districts where tanners and weavers worked, and even a few households closer to the cathedral. No obvious pattern linked them by age, occupation, or family ties. Some were barely adults, others well into their later years. The city's daily movement adjusted around the growing gathering. Merchants rooed their carts along back lanes to reach the main gates. Householders sent servants on longer paths to fetch water from the public wells. Church services continued on schedule, but attendance dropped slightly as curiosity or worry kept people near the square. Guards posted at the edges kept watch to prevent the dancers from wandering into the river or blocking essential traffic. They carried long staffs rather than weapons, using them gently to guide anyone who strayed too far. The air in the square carried the steady sounds of shuffling feet, heavy breathing, and the occasional thud when someone fell. Dust rose in small clouds with each step, mixing with the smells of sweat and the river breeze that drifted in from the Rhine. By the middle of the week, The count had reached over 70. The dancers now covered a space roughly the size of a large town hall. Their movements varied widely. Some stepped high and energetically, kicking up their knees in a manner that looked almost like a distorted march. Others shuffled with small, rapid steps that barely lifted their feet from the ground. A few turned in tight circles for long stretches before changing direction. When exhaustion forced a brief collapse, helpers from the crowd would offer a hand or a sip of water, then step back as the fallen person rose again. Medical observers noted that many dancers developed raw patches on the soles of their feet, sometimes bleeding through their shoes or stockings, yet the compulsion remained stronger than the pain. A dry observation from those days was that the city's usual summer flies seemed to avoid the dancers entirely, as if even the insects found the constant motion too unpredictable to bother with. The spread reached beyond the immediate square as reports traveled along trade routes. Boatmen carrying grain and timber downstream carried the news to smaller settlements along the Rhine. Travelers on the overland roads toward the Black Forest heard versions of the story and repeated them at inns. Within days, curious visitors began arriving from nearby towns. Some came to offer prayers at the edge of the crowd. Others simply stood and watched for an hour before continuing their journeys. A few brought small gifts of food or cloth, placing them on makeshift tables set up by the council for the dancers' support. The influx added to the general sense of disruption. The city gates stayed open longer than usual to accommodate the extra foot traffic, and the night watch was doubled in the central district. Inside the dancing group itself, small changes appeared. Some participants began to hum or sing short fragments of familiar songs between breaths. The tunes were not coordinated, so the result was a low, overlapping murmur that mixed with the sound of footsteps. A handful of dancers showed moments of apparent awareness, glancing toward the watchers with tired eyes before the motion pulled their attention away again. Others remained completely absorbed, their faces showing little expression beyond the strain of continued effort. The group as a whole moved slowly across the square over the course of a day, gradually wearing new paths into the packed earth. Straw was sometimes scattered to cushion the ground, but it quickly became trampled and mixed with dust. Council records from the period noted the growing strain on public resources. Extra bread was baked in the communal ovens and distributed at regular intervals. Barrels of watered wine and weak ale were brought in to prevent dehydration. Volunteers, mostly older residents and some clergy, took turns offering assistance without joining the dance themselves. The physicians returned for further observations, taking notes on pulse rates and breathing patterns whenever a dancer paused long enough to be examined. Their findings remained inconclusive. No single symptom united the entire group beyond the relentless movement and the resulting fatigue. As the numbers approached 100, the atmosphere in the square shifted again. The constant motion created a low, rhythmic rumble that could be heard several streets away. At night, lanterns and torches lit the area more brightly than on ordinary evenings, giving the scene an almost theatrical quality from a distance. Families living nearby kept their windows shuttered against the noise and the dust. Children were kept indoors after dark, though some still found ways to peek through cracks in the shutters. The event had moved from a local curiosity to a city-wide concern that touched nearly every household in some indirect way. The spread also brought quieter human moments. One dancer, a young mother, was gently led aside by relatives when she briefly slowed. They managed to get her home for a short rest, but within 2 hours she had returned to the square and resumed her place. Another participant, an elderly Tor, danced with a measuring tape still draped around his neck, the strip of cloth swaying with each turn. These small details reminded observers that the dancers were not anonymous figures, but neighbors, relatives, and fellow citizens whose ordinary lives had been interrupted without warning. By the end of the second week, the dancing had become the central fact of life in Strasbourg for many residents. Work continued where it could, but conversations, meals, and even sleep patterns adjusted to the ongoing spectacle. The river continued to flow past the city walls. Boats arrived and departed on schedule, and the cathedral bells still rang the hours. Yet underneath the routine, a shared unease settled in. People wondered who might be next. They watched their own legs with sudden self-consciousness. After long days on their feet, the physicians and council members met more frequently, searching for any measure that might contain the growth. No clear solution presented itself. The dancers kept moving, their numbers still increasing in small increments each day, while the rest of the city adapted as best it could to the strange new rhythm that had taken hold in its heart. Official response. With the dancers now filling a significant portion of the market square, and their numbers continuing to rise, the City Council of Strasbourg could no longer treat the matter as a private affliction. Meetings were called more frequently in the council chamber, a solid stone room located near the town hall. The members sat around a long wooden table, their faces lit by candles and the afternoon light coming through narrow windows. Reports from the guards and physicians were read aloud. The discussions were practical and serious. Some councillors spoke of the need to restore order quickly, to prevent interference with trade. Others worried about the health of the citizens and the possible spread of whatever force was at work. The physicians of the city were invited to these sessions. They had spent hours observing the dancers, taking notes on their condition. Several theories were presented. One doctor suggested that the problem came from an imbalance in the bodily humors, particularly an excess of hot blood that needed to be released through continued movement. Another mentioned the possibility of corrupted air rising from the river during the warm summer months. A third pointed to the recent poor harvests and the consumption of bread made from lower quality grain, which had been known to cause strange behaviors in other places in past years. The debate was careful, and based on the medical knowledge available in the 1500s, no one proposed a single clear answer. Instead, they weighed the options for what action the city should take. After several lengthy discussions, a decision was reached that surprised many. Rather than attempting to force the dancers to stop or isolating them in a separate building, the council voted to support the dancing. The thinking was that the compulsion might run its course faster if given proper outlet. A large wooden stage was ordered to be constructed in the square to give the dancers a better surface and to contain the activity in one place. More importantly, the city hired professional musicians, pipers, drummers, and fiddlers to play continuous music. The hope was that structured melodies would help organize the movements and bring the episode to a quicker end. The work on the stage began almost immediately. Carpenters and laborers set up planks raised slightly off the ground. The platform was wide enough to accommodate dozens of people at once. When it was finished, the dancers were gently encouraged to move onto it. The musicians took their positions at the edge and began to play. At first, the sound was tentative, but it soon settled into a steady beat that carried across the square. The effect was immediate in one sense. The dancers responded to the rhythm, their steps becoming somewhat more synchronized with the tunes. Yet the number of participants did not decrease. If anything, the music seemed to draw additional people from the surrounding streets. The council continued to monitor the situation closely. Daily reports were required from the physicians and the guards. Food supplies were organized more systematically, with bread, cheese, and diluted wine distributed at set times. Volunteers helped those who fell on the platform to rest briefly at the sides before they returned to the movement. The physicians made further observations, noting that while some dancers appeared to be losing weight rapidly from the constant activity, others showed surprising stamina. One older participant was reported to have danced for nearly 4 full days with only short breaks. Outside the square, life in Strasbourg adapted to the new arrangement. The presence of music changed the soundscape of the central district. The tunes could be heard several streets away, mixing with the normal sounds of carts and voices. Some residents found the constant playing irritating after a few days, while others accepted it as part of the strange new reality. Trade continued, but merchants noted that customers spent less time bargaining and more time glancing toward the square. The city gates remained open, and the flow of goods along the Rhine went on largely as usual, though boatmen often paused longer than normal to inquire about the latest developments when they docked. The official response reflected the practical spirit of the time. The authorities did not panic or impose harsh measures. They attempted to manage the situation using the tools and beliefs they had. Hiring the musicians was an active intervention, based on the idea that the body could purge itself through the very activity it craved. It was a bold choice, one that later chroniclers would discuss with a mixture of amazement and skepticism. For the people living through those weeks, it meant that the dancing continued under more organized conditions, with music providing a constant backdrop to the days and nights. As July progressed, the council met almost daily to review progress. The number of dancers on the platform fluctuated, but stayed high, sometimes reaching well over 100. The physicians continued their consultations, comparing notes with colleagues from other towns who had heard of the event. Letters were sent to nearby cities asking for any similar experiences in the past. The responses offered little new insight. The decision to support, rather than suppress, the dancing remained in place, even as some councillors began to express doubts about its effectiveness. The human side of the response was visible in small ways. Family members of the dancers were allowed close access to bring personal items or speak encouraging words. Even if the dancers rarely responded, clergy visited the edges of the platform to offer blessings. The guards developed a routine for helping exhausted participants to the side for short rests. The entire city seemed to hold a collective breath, waiting to see whether the chosen treatment would finally bring relief. By the later part of the month, the official approach had become the accepted way of dealing with the outbreak. The stage stood as a central feature in the market square. The musicians rotated in shifts to keep the music going through the night, and the dancers continued their endless circuits. The response had turned a chaotic scene into something more structured, though no less puzzling. The council's records from this period show a city trying to balance compassion, order, and practicality in the face of an event that defied easy explanation. The music played on, the feet kept moving, and the authorities continued their careful watch, hoping that their chosen path would soon lead the city back to its normal, quiet rhythms. The music and the dance. The musicians hired by the council took up their positions at the edge of the newly built wooden platform shortly after the decision was made. There were pipers with their wooden flutes, drummers with small hand drums and larger barrel-shaped ones, and fiddlers who drew bows across strings stretched over simple wooden bodies. They worked in rotating shifts, so the music never fully stopped, even as night turned to day and back again. The tunes they played were familiar ones from local festivals and processions, simple melodies that had been heard in Strasbourg for generations. At first, the notes sounded tentative in the open square, but they quickly settled into a steady pulse that carried over the shuffling of feet and the breathing of the dancers. Once the music began in earnest, the movements on the platform took on a slightly different character. The dancers responded to the rhythm in their own ways. Some matched their steps more closely to the beat of the drums, lifting their knees in time with each thump. Others followed the higher notes of the pipes, turning or swaying in patterns that loosely echoed the melody. The fiddlers added a layer of quicker notes that seemed to urge faster motion from certain individuals. The overall effect was not harmony in any artistic sense, but a continuous backdrop that kept the activity going without pause. The platform itself, raised a foot or so off the ground, creaked softly under the weight of dozens of people moving at once. Its surface grew scuffed and dusty within hours, and volunteers sprinkled fresh straw between sets to provide some cushion. The schedule of the music extended around the clock. During daylight hours, the full group of musicians played together, their instruments blending under the summer sun. At sunset, lanterns were hung along the edges of the platform, and a smaller team continued through the night. The night shifts used fewer instruments to conserve energy, but the sound remained constant enough to guide the dancers, who showed no sign of slowing. Guards and volunteers stayed on duty in shifts as well, offering water or small pieces of bread to anyone who slowed long enough to accept them. The square took on a different feel after dark, with the lantern light casting long shadows that moved in time with the steps and the flickering flames. As the days passed, the constant music drew additional participants from farther parts of the city. A Tor who had been working late in his shop heard the distant notes and walked to the square, only to step onto the platform and join the others. A boatman, who had just unloaded cargo at the river docks, paused to listen and found himself moving in step before he realized what was happening. The numbers on the platform fluctuated, but generally stayed above 100, sometimes reaching higher when the tunes grew particularly lively. The musicians noticed that certain melodies seemed to increase the energy of the group more than others, though they had no way to test this systematically, and simply continued playing whatever came next in their repertoire. A dry observation from those long hours was that the drummers eventually learned to time their breaks around the moments when the dancers were most likely to collapse. Since a sudden silence might have caused even greater confusion than the steady beat, the physical toll of the dancing under the music became more apparent with each passing day. Many dancers lost noticeable weight, their faces growing thinner and their clothes hanging more loosely. Blisters on their feet turned into open sores in some cases, yet the motion continued. The platform showed signs of wear as well, with boards beginning to loosen in places from the unrelenting pressure of hundreds of footsteps. Volunteers brought in extra planks to repair spots as needed. The physicians continued their rounds, checking on individuals during brief lulls when someone sat at the edge for a few minutes. They recorded higher pulses and labored breathing in almost everyone, but still found no single underlying illness that explained the compulsion. Nighttime on the platform presented its own challenges. The lanterns cast a softer glow, and the music took on a quieter tone, with fewer instruments. Some dancers moved more slowly in the cooler air, their steps dragging at times, but they rarely stopped for long. The night watch kept a closer eye on the edges to prevent anyone from wandering off the platform. In the dim light, a few volunteers brought blankets for those who collapsed and needed a short rest away from the main activity. By morning, the full group of musicians returned. The daylight renewed the energy of the tunes, and the cycle repeated. The music and dance became the central focus of the square for most of late July. Merchants set up their stalls at a greater distance to allow space, and the usual market noise mixed with the steady playing of pipes and drums. Residents passing through the area on errands paused longer than they might have otherwise, watching the scene with a mixture of concern and quiet acceptance. The council received daily updates on the condition of the platform and the number of active dancers. The musicians were paid from city funds and given meals to sustain them through the extended shifts. Some of them began to show fatigue themselves, rubbing sore shoulders or wrists between pieces, but they kept the music flowing as instructed. As the weeks progressed, small adjustments were made to the arrangement. The council ordered stronger supports added under the platform after a section sagged slightly under the weight. Extra musicians were brought in from neighboring guilds to allow longer rest periods for the original group. The tunes gradually included more variations to prevent complete repetition, though the basic rhythms stayed consistent. The dancers themselves showed no preference for one style over another. Their movements adapted to whatever was played at the moment. By the end of July, the scene had become a normalized part of city life for the time being, with the music serving as both treatment and constant reminder of the unusual situation. The human element remained visible amid the organized activity. Family members of dancers continued to visit the edges of the platform, sometimes calling out names or holding up small items from home. Clergy offered prayers at set times each day, standing just beyond the musicians. The guards developed a quiet efficiency in helping people on and off the platform when needed. Through it all, the music never fully ceased, and the dancing continued its steady course under the summer sky and the lantern light. The combination of hired musicians and the dedicated platform turned the earlier chaotic gatherings into something more contained, even if the underlying compulsion showed no sign of weakening. The days blended into one another, with the rhythm of the instruments, marking the passage of time more clearly than the church bells alone. Exhaustion mounted visibly among the participants, yet the activity persisted. The council continued to monitor the results of their chosen approach, recording observations in the town ledgers for later review. The music filled the square from morning until late at night, and then through the early hours again, guiding the dancers through yet another cycle, while the rest of Strasbourg carried on with its necessary work around the edges of the spectacle. Daily life in 1518 Strasbourg. While the music from the hired musicians continued to drift across the market square and the DA dancers kept their steady motion on the raised platform. The rest of Strasbourg went about its ordinary business in the summer of 1518. The city did not come to a halt. Boats still unloaded barrels and sacks at the docks along the Rhine. Apprentices carried tools to workshops. Women drew water from public fountains and carried it home in heavy buckets. The cathedral bells rang at regular intervals, calling people to prayer or marking the end of a workday. Life in the free imperial city moved forward in its familiar patterns, even as the strange activity in the central square drew occasional glances from passers-by. The event had become part of the background for most residents, something to work around rather than stop for entirely. In those weeks, the social structure of Strasbourg showed itself clearly in the way people went about their tasks. The city operated under a system of ranks that had developed over centuries within the Holy Roman Empire. At the top sat the patrician families and wealthy merchants who controlled much of the trade, and sat on the city council. These households lived in larger stone and timber houses with multiple stories, often featuring carved wooden beams and small gardens in the rear. The men typically wore tunics of fine wool or imported cloth, sometimes trimmed with fur, paired with close-fitting hose and sturdy leather shoes. Women in these families dressed in layered gowns of better quality fabric, with fitted bodices and full skirts that reached the ground, often covered by an apron only when necessary. Their daily food included fresh meat from the market, fish from the river, bread made from higher-grade wheat, and vegetables seasoned with spices brought up the Rhine. Meals were taken at set times around a table with wine or strong ale served alongside. Habits revolved around business dealings in the morning, meetings with guild leaders in the afternoon, and family prayers or reading in the evening. These families kept servants and maintained connections with traders in distant cities, which gave them a broader view of events beyond the local walls. Below them came the guild artisans and master craftsmen, who formed the solid middle layer of society. These included bakers, butchers, weavers, carpenters, and metalworkers who lived in more modest timber houses crowded along the narrower streets. Their clothing was practical and durable, men in woolen jerkins over linen shirts, knee-length breeches, and wooden clogs or simple leather boots for work. Women wore plain wool dresses with linen undergarments and head coverings of white cloth tied neatly under the chin. Food for these households centered on rye or mixed grain bread, thick vegetable soups or porridges, cheese, occasional sausage or smoked meat, and plenty of beer brewed locally. A typical day began before dawn with the lighting of fires and the start of craft work. Apprentices and journeymen worked long hours under the master's direction, learning the trade while handling the heavier tasks. Evenings brought a simple supper shared with family, followed by early rest to prepare for the next day. Guild rules governed prices, quality, and working conditions, creating a sense of order and mutual support within each trade. Further down the scale were the laborers, day workers, and servants who made up a large portion of the population. They occupied small rooms in the upper stories of houses or in outbuildings, often sharing space with others in similar circumstances. Clothing here was the simplest: rough linen shirts and tunics for men, patched wool garments and long skirts for women, with wooden clogs as the most common footwear because they lasted longer on the muddy or dusty streets. Food consisted mainly of coarse bread, boiled grains, root vegetables like turnips or cabbage, and thin soup made from whatever was available. Meat appeared rarely, perhaps once a week if the household could afford it. Their habits were dictated by the needs of others. Servants rose earliest to fetch water, prepare food, or clean the houses of wealthier families. Day laborers sought work at the docks or in construction, carrying loads or digging ditches from sunup until dusk. Evenings were short, with most people eating quickly and sleeping soon after dark to conserve energy for the next day's labor. This group felt the effects of recent poor harvests most directly as higher grain prices stretched their resources thin. The clergy occupied a separate place in the daily order. Priests, monks, and nuns, associated with the cathedral and smaller churches, wore distinctive robes of dark wool with white collars or hoods, depending on their order. They lived in communal houses or within the cathedral complex, eating meals prepared in monastery kitchens that often included better bread, garden produce, and fish on certain days. Their routines centered on the church calendar, morning prayers, masses throughout the day, visits to the sick, and record-keeping in the evenings. Many provided counsel or aid to the poorer residents, which brought them into contact with all levels of society. Outside the city walls, the peasants who farmed the surrounding lands formed yet another layer. They lived in small villages of thatched cottages, working the fields from first light. Men wore simple tunics and breeches of heavy linen or wool, with broad-brimmed hats for sun protection. Women dressed in layered skirts and blouses, often barefoot or in basic clogs when working the soil. Their food was the most basic of all: dark rye bread, porridge, seasonal greens, eggs when hens laid, and very little meat except at harvest time or festivals. Daily habits followed the cycle of planting, tending crops and harvesting, with extra labor required when taxes or rents were due. Many walked into Strasbourg on market days to sell produce or buy tools, bringing news from the countryside with them. A quirky detail from that summer was that even as the dancers filled the square, the city's bakers still delivered their loaves door to door on schedule, and some customers insisted on examining each one closely for any unusual discoloration, as if the strange events might have somehow tainted the bread itself. These divisions shaped how people experienced the dancing in the square. Patrician families discussed it during council meetings and sent servants to observe. Guild artisans paused their work to deliver supplies or check on relatives who might have joined the group. Laborers and servants felt the extra strain when household routines shifted to accommodate the ongoing situation. The clergy offered prayers and sometimes visited the platform to bless those affected. Peasants coming in from the fields heard the music and the shuffling feet and carried stories back to their villages. Yet daily work continued across all groups. Markets opened each morning with stalls selling cloth, tools, and foodstuffs. Carts rumbled over the cobblestones. Children played in alleys away from the central square. Families prepared meals, mended clothes, and tended small gardens. The river traffic kept the docks busy, and the gates opened and closed on time to control movement in and out of the city. The summer heat added its own challenges to these routines. Days started early to avoid the worst of the afternoon warmth. Windows stayed shuttered during the peak hours, and people sought shade wherever they could. Water consumption rose, and the public fountains saw longer lines. Food supplies were watched carefully because the previous year's poor harvests had left stores lower than usual. Bread, the staple for nearly everyone, was stretched with other grains when possible. Beer and weak wine helped quench thirst and provided some calories. Clothing choices reflected the season as well. Lighter linen layers replaced heavier wool for those who could manage it, though most simply rolled up sleeves and worked through the discomfort. Even with the unusual activity in the square, the city maintained its essential functions. The council continued to meet and issue orders on trade and public order. Guild halls hosted their regular gatherings, though conversations often turned to the dancers. Households adjusted sleeping arrangements if a family member had joined the platform. The overall pace of life remained steady, grounded in the same habits that had sustained Strasbourg for generations. The social classes interacted daily in the markets and streets, each contributing to the city's economy in its own way. The wealthy provided capital for larger ventures. The artisans produced goods, the laborers supplied the muscle, and the clergy tended to spiritual needs. This layered system, while unequal, created a functional whole that kept the city operating, even under strain. As the days of music and dancing stretched on, these everyday patterns provided a quiet counterpoint to the scene in the square. People still greeted neighbors, bargained over prices, and planned for the coming harvest. The dancing remained a concern, but it did not erase the routines that defined life in 1518. The platform stood as a visible reminder in the heart of the city. Yet the workshops hummed, the kitchen smelled of baking bread, and the river flowed past the walls as it always had. The social classes continued their separate yet connected existences, each handling the situation according to their means and place in the order of things. The summer progressed with its usual mix of labor, small comforts, and shared worries. While the music played on, and the feet kept moving in the square. The peak. As July moved deeper into its warmer stretches, the platform in the market square held more participants than anyone had anticipated at the start. The count climbed past 200 and kept rising until it approached 400 at certain hours. People from every corner of Strasbourg, and even a few from outlying villages, found their way onto the wooden structure, their steps joining the continuous flow guided by the musicians' steady tunes. The platform, sturdy as it was, now bore the weight of so many bodies that its boards groaned more noticeably with each shift in the crowd. Space became tight, with dancers brushing shoulders as they moved, yet the motion never halted for long. The council ordered additional planks laid at the edges to expand the area slightly, and volunteers worked quickly to secure them, while the music played on without interruption. Exhaustion appeared in clearer forms by this stage. Faces that had looked merely tired in the earlier weeks now showed deep hollows under the eyes. Cheeks sank inward, and many dancers lost enough weight that their clothing hung loosely, sleeves slipping down arms during turns. The constant activity without proper rest took its toll on muscles and joints. Legs that had once lifted with some energy now dragged at times, creating slower patterns among the group. Blisters that had formed earlier turned into raw patches, and some feet left faint traces of blood on the straw-covered boards. Collapses happened more often throughout the day. A dancer would falter, knees buckling, and drop to the platform for several minutes or longer. Helpers moved in promptly to pull the person to the side, offer sips of water or thin broth, and sometimes apply clean cloths to wounds before the individual rose again and resumed the steps. The physicians kept their careful records during these peak days. They noted rapid heartbeats in nearly everyone examined, and shallow breathing that grew labored as the hours passed. A few dancers developed fevers from the strain, their skin hot to the touch, even in the shade provided by temporary awnings the council had added. Others showed signs of confusion, staring blankly for moments before the compulsion pulled them back into motion. The doctors consulted among themselves in the square, comparing observations without reaching new conclusions. They continued to support the council's approach of allowing the dancing to continue, believing any forced stop might worsen the condition. Extra supplies of bread and diluted wine were brought in twice as often to combat dehydration and low energy, though many dancers took only small amounts before returning to the group. A quirky detail from those crowded days was that one of the fiddlers swore he could tell which dancers had once been weavers. By the way, their fingers still twitched in a familiar threading motion, even while their feet kept up the unrelated rhythm. Deaths began to occur amid the exhaustion. The first recorded loss came in the third week, when an older laborer who had joined early collapsed and did not rise again after a particularly long stretch of movement. His body was carried from the platform by guards and examined by the physicians who listed the cause as complete physical collapse after days without adequate rest. Word of the death spread quietly through the city, adding a heavier tone to the conversations in workshops and market stalls. Within days, two more followed, a middle-aged woman from a guild household and a younger servant who had danced almost non-stop since the second week. Both showed signs of heart strain and severe fatigue, according to the medical notes. The council ordered simple burials outside the main cemetery to avoid alarming the general population. But the news still circulated among families. Volunteers increased their efforts to watch for anyone showing extreme distress, pulling them aside for longer rests when possible. The platform scene at its height presented a steady, unrelenting picture. The musicians rotated more frequently to keep their own strength up, playing through the heat of midday and the cooler evenings alike. Lanterns burned from early dusk until well after midnight, illuminating the moving figures in a constant glow. The sound of footsteps mixed with the instruments created a low rumble that carried farther than before, reaching even the quieter residential lanes. Families of the dancers gathered at the edges in greater numbers, some bringing small personal items like a favorite cap or a piece of cloth, in hopes it might provide comfort. They called out names softly or simply watched for signs of recognition, Though most participants remained focused on the motion, the guards maintained order around the perimeter, ensuring no one wandered off and that supplies reached those who needed them most. As the numbers peaked, the council held additional meetings to address the growing strain on city resources. Extra funds were allocated for food distribution and for hiring more helpers to assist the exhausted dancers. The physicians suggested minor changes, such as adding certain herbal infusions to the water, offered based on traditional remedies for fatigue. These were prepared and distributed without noticeable effect on the overall compulsion. Trade in the square continued at the outer edges, with merchants adjusting their hours, slightly to avoid the busiest periods of activity. Boat traffic on the Rhine remained steady, though arriving crews often inquired about the latest count before unloading their cargo. The city walls and gates operated as usual, with no restrictions placed on movement, despite the unusual conditions inside. The human impact extended beyond the platform itself. Households missing a member adjusted their daily tasks, with neighbors stepping in to help, with chores or childcare when needed. Children in affected families were kept away from the square during peak hours, though some older ones still found vantage points from upper windows to observe. The clergy increased their visits, offering quiet prayers at set times each day, without interfering with the music or the dancers. Records from the period show that most deaths were linked directly to prolonged physical exertion, rather than any new illness spreading through the group. The total number of fatalities stayed relatively low compared to the hundreds involved, yet each one deepened the concern among residents. By the later days of the peak, the exhaustion had become the dominant feature of the gathering. Dancers who had entered the activity with some reserve now moved with visible effort, their steps shorter and their posture more stooped. The platform required frequent repairs as boards loosened under the weight and constant pressure. Straw was replaced daily to cover the worn surfaces and absorb some of the dust raised by so many feet. The musicians adapted their playing to slightly slower tempos at times when the group seemed most fatigued, though they followed council instructions to maintain enough rhythm to support the treatment approach. Volunteers developed a routine for rotating those who needed longer breaks to the edges, where they could sit or lie down briefly under supervision. The peak also highlighted the limits of the body under such sustained demand. Some dancers showed moments of apparent relief when they collapsed for longer periods, only to stand and rejoin once strength returned in part. The physicians documented cases of swollen joints and strained ligaments. Yet, no one could explain why the urge to continue remained so strong. Council ledgers from these weeks list increased expenditures for bread, wine, and medical supplies, along with payments to additional musicians and guards. The event had stretched the city's organizational capacity, yet the response remained measured and practical. No panic measures were introduced, and daily life outside the square carried on with its necessary tasks. As the height of the outbreak held steady, the first death served as a clear marker that the situation had reached a serious level. Families mourned privately, and the burials took place with minimal ceremony to maintain calm. The dancers who remained continued their movements under the same music and watchful eyes, their numbers still high, even as some began to show signs of gradual slowing. The platform stood as the focal point of the city's attention, its activity a constant presence through the warm days and lengthening evenings. The council continued its daily reviews, the physicians their observations, and the volunteers their quiet assistance. The peak had brought the dancing plague to its most visible and demanding phase, with hundreds caught in the compulsion, while exhaustion claimed its first victims, and the rest of Strasbourg adapted around the edges of the extraordinary scene. Medical theories of the era. As the outbreak reached its highest numbers on the platform in late July, the physicians of Strasbourg spent more time at the edges of the square, observing the dancers closely and comparing notes among themselves. Platform, where the sound of chanting mixed briefly with the music of the pipes and drums. A dry observation from those weeks was that several dancers seemed to time their brief collapses to coincide exactly with the end of a particular hymn, as if, even in exhaustion, their bodies still respected the rhythm of the liturgy. Church records from the period show an increase in confessions and small donations to the Cathedral Fabric Fund, suggesting that the event prompted many to examine their own conduct. Families affected by the dancing sought spiritual guidance more frequently, asking whether the affliction might be a test of faith or a call to greater devotion. The clergy responded with measured counsel, emphasizing patience and trust in divine providence rather than fear. No official proclamation declared the dancing a miracle or a curse. Instead, it was treated as one of the mysterious trials that God sometimes permitted for reasons beyond human understanding. The religious explanations did not conflict directly with the medical ones in most minds. Many residents saw the humoral imbalance as the physical mechanism through which a higher purpose operated. A hot excess of blood could be both a bodily condition and a sign of spiritual unrest. This combined view allowed people to accept the council's practical measures, while still turning to prayer and saintly intercession for ultimate relief. Candles burned longer at side altars, and rosaries were fingered more often during evening hours when the lanterns lit the platform. The cathedral bells continued to ring on schedule, their steady tones providing a counterpoint to the music in the square. As August began, some clergy noted subtle shifts that they attributed to answered prayers. A few dancers appeared to move with slightly less intensity after participating in special masses held for their intention. Whether this resulted from spiritual grace or simply the passage of time and growing fatigue remained open to interpretation. The priests avoided claiming credit for any improvement, preferring to stress continued devotion. Families expressed gratitude through small gifts to the church, such as wax for candles or linen for altar cloths. The religious response thus wove itself into the fabric of the city's handling of the event, offering meaning and comfort where medical understanding reached its limits. The broader atmosphere in Strasbourg reflected this blend of faith and daily endurance. People attended services with renewed seriousness, yet work at the docks and in the workshops went on without pause. The dancing on the platform continued under the dual watch of physicians and clergy, each group applying its own framework without interference. Sermons grew slightly longer in some parishes, incorporating references to endurance and the mystery of suffering. Processions became more frequent, their routes sometimes adjusted to pass near the affected area. Through all of it, the church provided a steady presence that helped maintain order and hope amid the unusual summer. Religious explanations also traveled beyond the city walls. Letters carried by merchants and clergy to other towns mentioned the possible role of Saint Vitus and the need for collective repentance. Similar discussions arose in neighboring communities, though no new outbreaks followed immediately. The event reinforced existing beliefs about the interplay between the physical and spiritual worlds. For the people of 1518, the dancing was not merely a medical puzzle, but also a matter that touched the soul. Prayers rose alongside the music from the square, and the cathedral stood as a silent witness to both the affliction and the community's response to it. The clergy's measured approach helped prevent the situation from escalating into widespread panic or accusations. No hunts for witches or sorcerers disrupted the city, a restraint that reflected the practical leadership of the time. Instead, the focus remained on piety, charity, and trust in providence. As the weeks passed, this religious lens allowed residents to integrate the strange events into their understanding of the world without discarding the routines that sustained them. The platform remained active, the music played on, and the dancers continued their movements, while prayers and blessings formed a quiet but constant accompaniment to the visible activity. In the heart of Strasbourg, the decline. As August settled over Strasbourg with slightly cooler mornings and shorter evenings, the activity on the platform in the market square began to show the first clear signs of easing. The numbers of active dancers, which had held steady near 400 during the peak weeks, started to drop in small but noticeable increments. Some participants who had been moving for days on end finally remained seated at the edges after a collapse, accepting longer rests and then standing only to walk slowly away rather than rejoin the group. The musicians continued their shifts, but the council quietly instructed them to shorten certain pieces and allow brief silences between sets, testing whether the reduced rhythm might encourage the remaining dancers to stop. The platform itself looked less crowded, with visible gaps between the figures and patches of straw showing through where feet no longer passed so constantly. The decline unfolded gradually across the first half of the month. By early August, the count had fallen below 300, and new additions became rare. Those who left the platform did so without fanfare. A carpenter, who had danced for nearly 3 weeks, sat down one afternoon, drank a full cup of the herbal water provided by volunteers, and then walked home with his family supporting him on either side. Similar scenes repeated in the following days. A servant woman from a patrician household paused mid-step, looked around as if noticing her surroundings for the first time in weeks, and stepped off the boards to rest on a nearby bench. She did not return. The physicians observed these departures closely, noting improved pulse rates and clearer eyes in those who had finally stopped. Exhaustion remained, but the compulsion appeared to be loosening its hold. The doctors continued their humoral explanations, suggesting that the summer heat had begun to moderate and the excess blood was cooling naturally. The council responded to the changes with practical adjustments. Daily meetings grew shorter as the urgency lessened. Funds previously set aside for extra bread and wine were scaled back, and the number of guards on duty around the square was reduced by half. The wooden platforms stayed in place for the time being, but repairs became less frequent now that the weight and constant motion had decreased. Musicians were told they could rotate more often and even take full days off when the numbers dipped below 200. The stage, once the center of constant activity, started to feel quieter, with the sound of footsteps no longer creating the low rumble that had carried through the streets for so many weeks. Volunteers who had assisted the dancers shifted some of their time back to regular city tasks, such as helping with the late summer harvest preparations outside the walls. City routines began to reassert themselves around the shrinking gathering. Market stalls moved back toward their usual positions, and merchants once again filled the square with the sounds of bargaining and cartwheels on the cobblestones. Boat traffic at the docks returned to its normal pace, with crews unloading goods without pausing as long to watch the platform. Families who had kept children indoors or sent them to relatives outside the city started to bring them back, allowing play in the alleys and visits to the market under ordinary supervision. The cathedral bells, which had seemed to compete with the music for weeks, now dominated the hourly rhythm once more. Workshops and guild halls resumed fuller schedules, with apprentices and masters focusing on orders that had been delayed. The river continued its steady flow past the walls, carrying the same mix of timber, grain, and passengers that had sustained the city before July. Those who had left the platform required time to recover. Many spent the first days after stopping in bed or sitting quietly in their homes, eating simple meals of bread and broth while their bodies adjusted to stillness. Blisters and raw patches on their feet healed slowly under clean wrappings, and muscles that had been overworked ached for a week or more. Families provided quiet care, offering small comforts like extra blankets or familiar foods. The physicians visited some of the more affected individuals at home, recording their progress in the same ledgers they had used in the square. Most showed steady improvement, though a few carried lasting fatigue that kept them from full work for several weeks. The deaths that had occurred at the peak remained the only permanent losses, and the city noted them in its records without public ceremony to allow normal life to resume. By the middle of August, the number of dancers had dropped below 100. The platform looked almost sparse, with the remaining participants moving in smaller clusters, rather than a dense crowd. The council discussed whether to dismantle the stage entirely, but decided to keep it a little longer in case any late rehearsals occurred. Musicians played shorter sets, and the lanterns were lit later in the evening, as fewer people needed light for nighttime activity. The clergy continued their visits, but shifted emphasis from prayers for relief to thanks for the easing of the affliction. Sermons in the cathedral touched on the return to ordinary devotion, and small offerings at St. Vitus' altars reflected gratitude more than urgent petition. The wider context of the Holy Roman Empire provided perspective. Letters arriving from other cities mentioned the event as a passing curiosity rather than an ongoing crisis, helping residents view their own experience as contained and temporary. The decline also allowed the city to address the practical aftermath. Council ledgers showed the total cost of the music, food, and platform construction, and modest taxes were adjusted in later months to balance the accounts without burdening any single group. Guilds resumed full production, filling orders that had waited during the busier weeks. Merchants reported that trade along the Rhine had suffered only minor delays, and the late summer harvest, though not abundant, proceeded without further disruption. Peasants from surrounding villages returned to their regular market days, bringing produce, and hearing updated accounts of the square that now sounded more like a story than current news. Those who had danced for the longest period sometimes carried small changes into their daily habits. A few walked with a slight limp for a time, favoring one foot over the other. Others spoke quietly of the experience to family members, but avoided dwelling on details in public conversations. The event left a mark on collective memory, without halting the city's forward movement. Children who had watched from windows later played games that mimicked the steady steps. Though parents discouraged it after a few days, the social classes returned to their separate yet connected routines. Patrician families resumed business dealings, artisans completed their craft work, laborers returned to the docks and fields, and the clergy maintained the church calendar as before. As the final days of August arrived, the platform held only a handful of dancers. The last ones stopped one by one, some after brief encouragement from relatives, and others simply because the urge had faded. The council ordered the musicians to cease playing entirely on the 24th day of the month, and the silence that followed felt noticeable to those who had grown used to the constant sound. Workers dismantled the wooden structure over the next few days, stacking the planks for storage and sweeping the square clean. Straw and debris were cleared away, and the market returned to its full layout. The physicians filed their final observations, noting that the humoral balance appeared restored in those who had been affected. The clergy offered a special Mass of Thanksgiving, attended by many who had watched the events unfold. The city tried to return to normal in quiet steps. Streets that had carried the rumble of footsteps now echoed with ordinary traffic. Taverns filled with their usual patrons, discussing trade and weather rather than the dancers. Households settled back into familiar patterns, with meals taken at regular hours and work beginning at dawn. The Rhine boats continued their journeys, carrying goods and the latest news that the strange summer episode had run its course. Records in the town hall preserved the details for future reference, but daily conversation moved on to the harvest, the approaching autumn festivals, and the ordinary concerns of life in a free imperial city. The decline had come slowly, without sudden drama or announcement. It reflected the same measured approach the council had taken from the beginning, allowing the body's own processes to complete their work. Residents accepted the return to routine with a sense of quiet relief rather than celebration. The platform was gone, the music silent, and the square once again served its everyday purpose. Those who had danced carried their recovery into the weeks ahead, rejoining their trades and families at a gentle pace. Strasbourg moved forward, its walls and river and cathedral unchanged, while the memory of the summer settled into the background of local history. The wider empire continued its complex affairs, and the city resumed its place within it, without lasting disruption. The dancing had lessened, the numbers had dwindled, and ordinary life reclaimed the streets in its steady, unremarkable way. Aftermath in Strasbourg. With the platform gone, and the last notes of music faded from the market square by the end of August, the survivors of the dancing began the slow process of reclaiming their place in ordinary life. Those who had left the activity earliest were already showing signs of improvement within the first week of September. They moved carefully around their homes, testing sore legs on short walks to the well or the bakery. Families kept meals simple and nourishing, offering warm broths thickened with barley and small portions of cheese to rebuild strength without overwhelming tired stomachs. Many spent the daylight hours resting on benches and shaded courtyards, their bodies, still adjusting to stillness, after weeks of constant motion. Blisters on their feet had started to scab over, and the raw patches were wrapped in clean linen strips, changed daily by relatives or neighbors. The physicians made house calls in the initial days, checking pulses and asking about sleep patterns, then noting in their ledgers that most cases followed a predictable path of gradual restoration. Once the compulsion lifted, by mid-September, the majority of the former dancers had returned to light tasks. A carpenter who had been among the early participants resumed work at his bench, though he limited himself to sanding, rather than heavy lifting, for another 10 days. A servant woman from a merchant household helped with kitchen duties again, stirring pots instead of carrying water buckets, until her balance felt steady. The city's guild records show that masters granted short extensions on apprenticeships for those affected, allowing extra time to regain full productivity. Children in the households adjusted too, no longer kept at a distance, but now helping with small errands that kept them close to recovering parents or siblings. The social layers of Strasbourg reconnected in quiet ways. Patrician families sent servants with baskets of extra bread to neighbors who had danced, while guild artisans shared tools or offered advice on mending worn shoes damaged during the weeks on the platform. The council turned its attention to closing the official chapter of the event. In the town hall, scribes updated the ledgers with final tallies. They listed the approximate number of participants at its height, the total cost of musicians' wages, platform construction, and daily supplies of bread and wine. Deaths were entered as a separate column, with brief notes on the individuals involved, and the cause listed simply as exhaustion following prolonged activity. No blame was assigned, and the entries remained factual, matching the practical tone the authorities had maintained throughout. Letters were prepared and sent to neighboring free cities and imperial officials summarizing the duration and resolution without alarm. These documents traveled along the Rhine trade routes, reaching desks in places like Basel and Freiburg within a fortnight. The council also reviewed its own decisions, confirming that the choice to support the dancing with music had aligned with the physician's guidance and had not led to wider unrest. Chronicers in Strasbourg began their work almost immediately after the last dancer stopped. Town scribes working in the same chamber where meetings had been held compiled daily notes into a more formal account. They included the date, the first steps appeared, the growth in numbers, the council's response, and the gradual decline. One prominent local writer connected to the cathedral added observations about the human faces he had seen on the platform, describing the mix of exhaustion and determination without embellishment. These records were copied carefully onto parchment and stored in the city archives alongside tax rolls and trade agreements. A few copies were shared with scholars outside the walls, where they joined other accounts of unusual events in the empire. The physicians contributed their own summaries, detailing the humoral observations and the course of recovery, which were later referenced in medical correspondence across the region. A quirky detail from those early recovery weeks was that one former dancer, a weaver by trade, kept unconsciously tapping his foot in a slow rhythm while seated at his loom for nearly a month afterward, until his wife gently placed a small cushion under it to break the habit. Life in the city normalized in layers over the following months. The market square filled completely again by the autumn fair, with stalls selling late-season produce and new woolens from the guilds. Boatmen at the docks unloaded their usual cargoes, without pausing to glance at the spot where the platform had stood. The river traffic resumed its steady pace, carrying news that the strange summer in Strasbourg had ended without lasting harm to trade. Families gathered for harvest meals, sharing stories of the weeks in the square only when asked, and even then in measured tones that treated the event as a closed chapter rather than a lingering shadow. The clergy noted an uptick in regular attendance at Mass through September and October, with many former dancers and their relatives expressing quiet gratitude during prayers of thanksgiving. No special feast or public commemoration was held. Instead, the return to routine itself served as the city's way of moving forward. Survivors who had lost the most weight or carried deeper fatigue required more time, Some did not resume full work until November, when cooler weather and shorter days matched their slower pace. A few older participants never regained the same stamina they had before July, shifting to lighter duties within their households or guilds. The community supported them through informal networks of neighbors and kin, ensuring no one faced hardship alone. Guild funds provided small assistance in cases of prolonged weakness, drawn from the same resources used for other civic needs. The physicians continued occasional checks into the winter, recording that most individuals had returned to their pre-event state by the turn of the year. Their notes emphasized that the body's natural resilience had prevailed once the external compulsion ended. The event found its place in the written memory of the city through careful, unadorned documentation rather than dramatic retellings. Scribes in the archives cross-referenced the dancing entries with weather logs and harvest reports from the same summer, creating a complete picture of the season. These records remained accessible to council members and visiting scholars, serving as a reference for future questions about public health or unusual gatherings. Letters exchanged between Strasbourg and other imperial cities preserved the facts in a network of correspondence that linked the free cities. One such exchange mentioned the total duration from first steps to final decline, estimating between 4 and 6 weeks of active participation for most. The accounts avoided speculation on causes, sticking instead to what had been observed and managed. As autumn gave way to winter, the streets of Strasbourg carried only the normal sounds of carts, footsteps, and conversation. The narrow lanes near the former platform site showed no lasting marks. Fresh cobblestones and swept gutters erased the scuffing from thousands of feet. Residents passed the spot daily, on their way to market or church, without comment. Their attention now on the approaching Christmas preparations and the routines that had always defined city life. Children who had watched the event from windows played ordinary games again, their parents no longer shielding them from the square. The social classes resumed their separate yet interdependent patterns. Merchants negotiated winter trade deals. Artisans completed indoor work by lamplight, laborers cleared snow from the docks, and the clergy observed the full church calendar without reference to the summer's interruption. The survivors themselves integrated back into these patterns at their own pace. Some spoke of the experience only in private, describing the tireless motion as a distant fog that had lifted. Others carried small reminders, such as a favored pair of repaired shoes or a linen cap worn during the weeks on the platform. No organized support group formed, yet the shared memory created quiet bonds between those who had danced and those who had watched. Families celebrated small milestones like the first full day without fatigue, or the return to a normal night's sleep. By the spring of 1519, the last traces of physical recovery had faded for nearly everyone involved. The recorded history of the event provided a stable anchor for the city's collective memory. Town archives kept the ledgers secure, protected from damp, and handled only by authorized scribes. Later visitors to Strasbourg sometimes asked about the summer of 1518, and the council allowed limited access to the summaries for those with scholarly interest. The documentation remained factual and concise, reflecting the same steady approach the authorities had taken while the dancing continued. No grand narrative was crafted at the time. Instead, the event settled into the background of local records alongside floods, market disputes, and guild agreements. Strasbourg itself showed no outward scars from the weeks of music and motion. The wall stood firm. The Rhine flowed on schedule, and the cathedral bells rang the hours as they had before. Trade resumed its pre-summer volume, and the guilds reported steady production once the affected workers returned. The council's careful management of resources left the city's finances balanced, with no long-term debt attributed to the platform or the musicians. Life moved forward in the same layered order of patricians, artisans, laborers, and clergy, each group contributing to the daily function of the free imperial city. The survivors walked among them again, their steps now purposeful and unhurried, part of the ordinary flow that had always sustained Strasbourg through seasons of both calm and trial. The aftermath thus closed with quiet efficiency. The city had managed the unusual episode, supported its people through recovery, and preserved the facts in its archives for whatever future reference might arise. Survivors found their way back to workbenches, kitchens, and market stalls, their bodies and routines restored. The record stood as a clear account, neither exaggerated nor forgotten, allowing the Bay community to treat the summer of 1518 as one more chapter in the ongoing story of a river city within the Holy Roman Empire. As winter snow settled on the rooftops and the new year began, the streets carried only the sounds of normal activity, the memory of the dancing confined to ledgers and quiet conversations. While Strasbourg continued its steady course along the Rhine, similar events in history. As the records in Strasbourg's archives settled into their shelves, and the city returned to its steady routines along the Rhine, the chroniclers and physicians who had documented the summer of 1518 also took note of something important. This was not the first time Europe had seen groups of people overtaken by an uncontrollable urge to dance. Similar episodes, often called dancing mania or choreomania in the medical writings of the period, had appeared in the region before, and a few smaller ones would follow in the decades after. These events shared certain features with what had happened in Strasbourg: sudden onset among ordinary residents, tireless motion that ignored fatigue and injury, and a tendency to spread through communities already facing hardship. Most occurred in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, or nearby territories along the Rhine and its tributaries, where trade routes, shared beliefs, and periodic stresses like poor harvests created conditions for such outbreaks to take hold. The authorities in those earlier cases often responded in much the same way the Strasbourg Council had, providing music and space rather than trying to force a halt. The earliest major outbreak that left clear traces in town records began on the 24th of June, in Tony, the year 1374, in the city of Aachen, then a prosperous center in the western part of the empire. It was the feast day of Saint John the Baptist, and the warm summer weather had brought crowds into the streets for the usual celebrations. Without any warning, people started moving in rhythmic, compulsive patterns that bore little resemblance to festival dances. They hopped, leaped, and turned with such intensity that many soon collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise and continue once they caught their breath. The numbers grew rapidly within days, reaching hundreds and then spreading outward from Aachen to nearby cities like Cologne and Liège. Chroniclers described the dancers as drenched in sweat, their feet bleeding from constant contact with the ground. Yet they kept going for hours and sometimes days at a stretch. From there the mania moved along the Rhine trade paths into Flanders, Franconia, Hainaut, Metz, and even as far as Utrecht and parts of what is now the Netherlands. Some accounts mention it reaching into Italy and the Duchy of Luxembourg before subsiding, after several months. The conditions in 1374 echoed those that would later face Strasbourg. The Black Death had swept through the region only a generation earlier, leaving populations thinned and economies strained. Recent floods and cold spells had damaged crops, driving up the price of bread and leaving many families short of food. Physicians of the time pointed to the same humoral imbalances that would be discussed in 1518, while clergy invoked Saint Vitus or other saints thought to hold power over nervous disorders. Local officials in Aachen and Cologne hired musicians to play pipes and drums, hoping the structured rhythm would help the dancers expend their energy and return to normal. The approach worked in the sense that the outbreaks eventually faded, though not before claiming lives from heart strain and sheer fatigue. Town ledgers from those cities recorded the costs of the music and extra provisions, much as Strasbourg would do later. The event left a lasting mark in the chronicles, where scribes noted the strange sight of entire market squares filled with moving figures, while the rest of daily life tried to carry on around the edges. Smaller incidents followed in the decades after 1374, showing that the pattern could flare up again under similar pressures. In 1381, the city of Augsburg experienced a burst of dancing that affected dozens rather than hundreds, lasting only a few weeks before subsiding. The dancers there were mostly from artisan households, and the episode passed without the widespread death seen in Arkham. Another cluster appeared in 1418, this time right in Strasbourg itself. Records from the city archives mention a group of residents who began moving uncontrollably in the streets near the cathedral. Though the numbers stayed modest, compared with what would happen a century later, the council, at that time, also turned to music and prayer, and the activity faded after about 10 days. Further east in 1428, the Swiss town of Schaffhausen saw a monk dance himself to exhaustion and death in one reported case, while a group of women in nearby Zurich entered a similar frenzy that lasted several days. These scattered outbreaks tended to occur in clusters along the Rhine and Moselle valleys, where the movement of goods and people allowed stories and perhaps the underlying stresses to travel quickly from one town to the next. The 1518 event in Strasbourg stood out not because the compulsion itself was new, but because of its scale and the detailed records kept by the council, physicians, and chroniclers. It drew directly on the experiences of earlier episodes, which is why the authorities knew to build the platform and hire musicians without hesitation. The treatment matched what had been tried in 1374, reflecting a shared body of practical knowledge passed down through guild and church networks. Yet by the time the last dancers in Strasbourg stopped in late August, the pattern of large-scale mania was already becoming rarer. The continent had begun to change in ways that reduced the conditions for such collective outbursts. Improved record-keeping through the printing press meant events were documented more precisely, and the early stirrings of religious reform encouraged different ways of understanding bodily afflictions. Still, a handful of smaller incidents appeared in the years that followed. One of the last notable clusters occurred in the 1530s in parts of Switzerland and southern Germany, where groups of children and young adults were reported dancing in villages near Basel. The numbers remained low, often under 50, and the episodes lasted only days rather than weeks. Another isolated case surfaced around 1551, in the region of Anhalt, where a few dozen people moved uncontrollably for a short period before the urge passed. These later examples showed the same restless steps and exhaustion, but lacked the deadly toll of the earlier outbreaks. By the late 1500s, the phenomenon had largely retreated into memory, with only occasional mentions in medical texts as a curiosity from a previous age. The reasons for the decline remain unclear, though historians point to better harvests in some decades, shifts in religious practice that emphasized individual devotion over collective rituals, and a general improvement in living conditions that reduced the acute despair that had once fueled the man's. A related but distinct form of dancing compulsion appeared in southern Italy during the same broad period, known locally as tarantism. There people claimed the urge came from the bite of a tarantula spider, and the prescribed cure involved hours of vigorous dancing to specific melodies played on tambourines and flutes. Whole villages would gather for these sessions, which could last days and involved colorful costumes and communal participation. While tarantism shared the tireless motion and use of music as treatment, it differed in its seasonal pattern, tied to summer harvests, and its stronger association with a supposed physical poison rather than humoral or divine causes. Travelers from the north sometimes compared it to the Rhine outbreaks, but the Italian cases rarely spread beyond their local communities and never reached the scale of 1374 or 1518. Across all these events, certain common threads ran through the historical accounts. They tended to strike during periods of social strain, famine, recent epidemics, or economic uncertainty when communities were already worn down. The dancers came from all levels of society, though artisans and laborers often formed the majority in the records. Chroniclers noted the same physical details: swollen feet, vacant stares, cries for help, mixed with the sound of footsteps. Religious explanations frequently invoked Saint Letus, whose shrines became destinations for some survivors seeking final relief through pilgrimage. Medical observers applied the same humoral theories, recommending continued movement rather than restraint. And in nearly every case, the provision of music by local authorities formed the core of the response, a practice that seemed to satisfy both the compulsion and the practical need to manage the situation without causing panic. The wider pattern also highlighted how these mania fit into the broader history of the Holy Roman Empire. The loose collection of cities and territories allowed ideas, goods, and misfortunes to travel along river routes and trade fairs, carrying the memory of one outbreak to the next. Yet the episodes remained regional rather than continental, rarely crossing into France or England in the same form. As the 1500s progressed, and the empire faced new challenges from religious divisions and shifting power among princes, the dancing mania faded from view. By the 1600s, they had become the stuff of scholarly references rather than living threats, appearing in treatises on melancholy or nervous disorders as examples of how the mind and body could respond to extreme stress. The disappearance of large-scale dancing mania by the late 1600s coincided with broader changes in European society. Better nutrition in many areas reduced the bodily weakness that had once amplified such urges. Advances in medical understanding, though still rooted in ancient texts, began to include more systematic observation. The spread of printed books allowed communities to learn from past events without repeating them on the same scale. In Strasbourg itself, the 1518 records served as a reference point for later generations, reminding officials that unusual behaviors could arise from shared hardship rather than supernatural forces alone. The city never experienced another outbreak of comparable size, and the archive stood as a quiet testament to both the vulnerability and the resilience of its people. These earlier and later episodes added depth to the story of what happened in Strasbourg. That summer, they showed that the dancing was not an isolated oddity, but part of a recurring phenomenon that had puzzled residents and leaders for centuries along the Rhine. Each case followed its own course, shaped by local conditions and the resources available at the time. Yet, they all reflected the same human limits when everyday stresses tipped into something more extreme. Chroniclers across the region preserved the details with varying degrees of detail, from brief entries in town ledgers to fuller accounts in monastery libraries. Together, they formed a scattered but consistent record of how communities responded when the ordinary rhythm of life gave way to an unexplained compulsion to keep moving. The pattern also offered a measure of perspective for those who lived through 1518. While the event felt unique and alarming in the moment, the knowledge of prior outbreaks helped the council and physicians choose their course with some confidence that the mania would eventually run its natural span. Survivors in Strasbourg could look back and know they were not alone in history, even if their own episode had been among the largest and most carefully managed. As the years passed, the dancing mania of Europe gradually slipped into the background of collective memory, recalled mainly in scholarly debates or fireside stories, rather than as active threats. The Rhine continued to carry trade and news between the same cities that had once hosted these strange gatherings, and life in those places resumed its steady pace once the music stopped and the feet finally rested. In the end, the similar events underscored a quiet truth about the era. The human body and mind, when pressed by hunger, illness, or uncertainty, could produce responses that defied easy explanation, yet followed recognizable patterns across time and place. The outbreaks came and went with the stresses of the age, leaving behind records that later generations would study for clues about collective behavior. Strasbourg's, as experience in 1518, thus took its place alongside the others in the historical ledger. One chapter in a longer sequence of puzzling episodes that revealed as much about the conditions of life in the Holy Roman Empire as they did about the mysteries of movement and exhaustion. The cities along the Rhine returned to their ordinary concerns. The chronicles closed their pages on the subject, and the dancing mans became part of the shared past rather than the present. Modern explanations. As the town archives in Strasbourg closed their ledgers on the summer of 1518, and the Rhine continued its steady flow past the city walls, later generations of scholars turned their attention to the records with fresh questions. By the 20th century, historians and scientists had access to new tools of analysis, including medical research on toxins, psychological studies of group behavior, and detailed examinations of the social and environmental conditions in the Holy Roman Empire. These modern perspectives did not dismiss the careful notes left by the physicians and chroniclers of the time, but they reframed the dancing plague within broader patterns of human response to hardship. The event, once explained through humors and saints, came to be seen as one example, among several, where communities under strain produced collective symptoms that followed the expectations of their era. One of the first modern theories to gain attention appeared in the middle decades of the 20th century and focused on a possible physical cause rooted in the local food supply. In the 1950s, a Swedish pharmacologist named Eugene Louis Bachmann examined accounts of the dancing outbreaks and suggested that ergot poisoning might have played a role. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye, the grain commonly used for bread in Strasbourg and the surrounding countryside. When consumed, it produces chemicals that can lead to convulsions, hallucinations, and a burning sensation in the limbs. Bachmann pointed to the poor harvests of the early 1500s, which had left grain stored in humid conditions where the fungus could thrive. Floods along the Rhine had created exactly the moist environment ergot needs, and the resulting contaminated bread could have affected large numbers of people who relied on rye as a staple. The theory gained traction because similar links between spoiled grain and strange behaviors had been noted in other historical outbreaks, and the symptoms of convulsive erotism included twitching and involuntary movements that might resemble uncontrolled dancing when viewed from a distance. Further investigation, however, revealed important limitations in the ergot explanation. Detailed studies of ergot poisoning showed that while it can cause spasms and altered perceptions, it also tends to restrict blood flow to the extremities, often leading to gangrene in severe cases. People suffering from advanced ergotism typically become too weak or in too much pain to sustain prolonged physical activity. The dancers in Strasbourg, by contrast, had kept moving for days and even weeks, showing remarkable endurance, despite exhaustion and injuries to their feet. Modern laboratory recreations of ergot effects confirmed that the toxin more often produces a state of collapse or rigid convulsions rather than rhythmic, sustained motion. Historians also noted that not every participant came from households using the same batches of rye, and the outbreak spread to people who had not shared meals. These inconsistencies led many researchers to set the ergot theory aside as a partial contributor at best rather than the primary cause. The idea still appears in some popular accounts, but it no longer dominates scholarly discussion. The explanation that has gained the widest acceptance among historians and psychologists today centers on a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness. In the early 21st century, the British historian John Waller published detailed studies of the 1518 event and earlier dancing mania, drawing on both the original Strasbourg records and comparative cases from other times and places. Waller argued that the dancers were experiencing a form of collective psychological response, triggered by extreme stress and shaped by the cultural beliefs of their time. The years leading up to 1518 had been especially difficult for the region. Repeated famines in 1492, 1502, and 1511 had driven grain prices to their highest levels in generations. Diseases such as smallpox, syphilis, and recurring waves of the plague had left families grieving and fearful. In this atmosphere of hardship, a widespread local belief held that Saint Vitus could curse those who failed to honor him properly by forcing them into uncontrollable dancing. When the first woman began to move in the street, her actions fit exactly the expected form of that curse. Others, already worn down by worry and uncertainty, found their own bodies responding in the same way through a process of suggestion and unconscious imitation. The compulsion spread not because of a toxin, but because the mind under sufficient pressure can produce real physical symptoms that match shared fears. Waller's analysis emphasized several supporting details from the records. The dancers showed no uniform signs of fever or poisoning when examined by the physicians of the day. Yet they exhibited the trance-like focus and altered awareness typical of dissociative states. The fact that music seemed to influence the intensity of their movements aligned with known patterns in mass psychogenic episodes where external rhythms can reinforce the behavior. The council's decision to provide a platform and musicians, far from worsening the situation, may have helped channel the compulsion into a contained space, allowing it to run its course as the collective anxiety gradually eased. Similar outbreaks in the 1300s and 1400s had occurred under comparable conditions of famine and disease, always in communities that already believed in dancing, curses, or spirit possession. Waller compared the Strasbourg case to other documented instances of mass psychogenic illness in later centuries, such as the laughing epidemic in Tanganyika in 1963, where stress from social upheaval led to uncontrollable laughter that spread through schools and villages. In each instance, the symptoms matched what people expected to see, and they resolved once the immediate pressures lifted. Modern psychology has provided additional insight into how such episodes begin and spread. Researchers studying conversion disorders note that the brain can translate emotional distress into physical manifestations without any conscious intent. In a tightly knit community like 16th-century Strasbourg, where neighbors watched one another closely and shared the same stories of saints and curses, one person's visible distress could trigger similar responses in others through a process of social contagion. The absence of any single infectious agent or toxin in the medical examination supports this view. Instead, the outbreak reflected the human capacity to embody cultural ideas under duress. The physicians of 1518 had correctly observed that the dancers were not suffering from a conventional fever or injury, but they lacked the framework to recognize the role of shared psychological strain. Today's understanding integrates that older medical curiosity with knowledge of how the mind and body interact in times of collective hardship. A quirky detail noted by later researchers was that some modern simulations of stress-induced group behaviors in controlled settings have shown participants unconsciously mirroring the exact rhythms described in the Strasbourg accounts, even when no music was played, as if the body retains a memory of expected patterns from cultural stories. Scientists have also considered other possible contributing factors without elevating them to primary causes. Some have examined whether a mild form of encephalitis or another neurological condition might have affected a few individuals and then spread through suggestion. But the scale and duration of the event make isolated infections unlikely. Others have looked at the role of nutritional deficiencies caused by the poor harvests, which could have weakened nervous systems and made people more susceptible to psychological triggers. Yet none of these elements alone accounts for the sudden onset, the specific form of the compulsion, or the way it resolved once the summer waned. The mass psychogenic framework remains the most consistent with the evidence, because it explains both the physical symptoms and the social dynamics without requiring an external agent that the records fail to mention. In recent decades, the dancing plague has found a place in broader studies of historical psychology and public health. Conferences and journal articles have revisited the Strasbourg case alongside similar events in other parts of Europe, using it to illustrate how societies respond when ordinary coping mechanisms break down. Digital mapping of trade routes and harvest data from the period has allowed researchers to plot the precise environmental stresses that coincided with the outbreak, strengthening the connection between hardship and collective symptoms. Medical historians now emphasize that mass psychogenic illness does not imply the dancers were faking or imagining their distress. The exhaustion, blisters, and occasional deaths were entirely real. The body responds to the mind's signals with genuine physiological changes, and in 1518, those changes took the form that local culture had prepared people to expect. The modern perspective has shifted the way the event is remembered. Rather than a bizarre curiosity or a sign of medieval superstition, It stands as a reminder of how human communities can react to prolonged uncertainty. The same mechanisms that produced the dancing in Strasbourg have appeared in other settings, from factory outbreaks of twitching in the 19th century to school episodes of fainting or vocal tics in more recent times. Each case shares the feature of occurring in groups facing shared stress, with symptoms shaped by what people believe is possible or likely. For historians, this makes the 1518 plague a valuable window into the inner life of the 16th century, revealing the fears and beliefs that guided behavior when external controls proved insufficient. As research continues, new techniques such as analysis of surviving grain samples from the period or computer modeling of social networks may offer additional nuances. Yet, the core conclusion drawn by Waller and others has held steady. The dancers were responding to a perfect storm of material hardship and cultural expectation. Their feet moved, not because of a fungus or a demon, but because their minds, pushed to the limit, found an outlet in the one behavior that local tradition had marked as the consequence of neglect or divine attention. The council's practical response, though based on different assumptions, inadvertently gave the episode room to exhaust itself, much as supportive measures in later, psychogenic cases allow symptoms to fade once the triggering anxiety subsides. The Strasbourg outbreak thus takes its place in a longer sequence of events that reveal the boundaries of human endurance. Modern explanations do not diminish the suffering of those who danced, or the concern of those who watched. Instead, they place the episode within a framework that connects it to universal patterns of behavior under pressure. The records from 1518 remain as clear and factual as when they were first written, now supplemented by centuries of additional insight. Scholars continue to consult them, finding in the details of the platform, the musicians, and the slow decline a story of resilience as much as mystery. The river that carried news of the event to other cities still flows, and the city itself has grown and changed. Yet the questions raised by that summer continue to inform how we understand the interplay between body, mind, and society in times of strain. Today's view of the dancing plague emphasizes empathy alongside analysis. It acknowledges the very real limits of life in the 1500s, while highlighting the remarkable adaptability of communities that faced the inexplicable with the tools they had. The event no longer seems like an isolated oddity, but part of the broader human experience of navigating uncertainty. As new generations of historians and scientists examine the records, they do so with the advantage of distance and accumulated knowledge. Yet, they return again and again to the same central insight. When the ground beneath daily life shifts, the response can take forms that surprise even those who live through them. The dancing in Strasbourg ended as the stresses eased, just as similar episodes have done throughout history, leaving behind a legacy that modern understanding has helped to illuminate without fully erasing its quiet power to remind us of shared vulnerability. Reflections on the event. The records from Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 have remained in the city archives for more than 5 centuries, their pages still legible and their details as clear as when the scribes first set them down. The dancing plague never fully disappeared from historical memory. Scholars returned to the ledgers and letters in the following generations, copying passages into larger collections of unusual events and referencing them in medical treatises and town histories. By the 1600s, the episode had become one of those quiet landmarks in the story of the Holy Roman Empire, mentioned alongside floods and harvest failures, as an example of how ordinary life could tilt into the unexpected. Later centuries brought new layers of interest. Enlightenment writers saw it as evidence of superstition giving way to reason. 19th-century physicians used it to illustrate early ideas about nervous disorders. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, as we have seen, the event found its place in studies of mass psychogenic illness and the effects of collective stress. Through all these shifts in understanding, the core facts stayed unchanged. Hundreds of people moved without rest for weeks. The council responded with music and space, and the compulsion eventually faded as the summer waned. The lasting quality of the records lies in their plainness. They do not dramatize or moralize, they simply note what happened day by day until the platform was dismantled and the square returned to its usual market routines. What the dancing plague reveals most clearly is the vulnerability of human communities when everyday pressures accumulate beyond a certain point. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were not living in chaos. They had walls, guilds, a cathedral, and a river that brought trade and news. Yet the preceding years of poor harvests, high bread prices, and recurring illness had worn away at the ordinary buffers that keep daily life stable. In such conditions, the mind and body can respond in ways that match the fears and beliefs already present in the culture. The local stories about Saint Vitus and dancing curses provided a ready shape for the distress. And once the first woman began to move, others followed the pattern without conscious choice. This was not weakness or ignorance, but a human mechanism at work. Groups under strain often produce shared symptoms that feel physical and real because they are. The blisters, the exhaustion, and the occasional deaths were genuine consequences of sustained effort. The episode therefore stands as a reminder that resilience has limits. Even a well-ordered city with practical leaders and learned physicians could find itself facing something that no single remedy could stop immediately. The same pattern has appeared in other times and places, always tied to periods when people felt the ground beneath them shifting. At the same time, the event highlights the quiet strength of those communities. The council did not panic or impose harsh restrictions. Instead, it chose a measured approach based on the best advice available, hiring musicians and building a platform to contain and support the activity. Physicians observed and recorded without claiming false certainty. Clergy offered prayers and comfort without turning the square into a scene of accusation. Families and neighbors provided food, water, and quiet assistance. Day after day, the city continued its essential work at the docks, in the workshops, and in the fields outside the walls. This practical cooperation allowed the compulsion to run its course without wider disruption. When the numbers finally declined in August, the return to normal life happened gradually and without fanfare. Survivors recovered at their own pace, supported by their households and guilds. The archives preserved the details for future reference, and the city moved forward along the Rhine as it had before. The dancing plague, therefore, also tells a story of endurance. People adapted, managed resources, and restored routines, even while something inexplicable unfolded in the heart of the market square. The mystery that remains is not about the cause alone, but about the precise line where ordinary fatigue crosses into collective compulsion. Modern explanations point to stress and cultural expectation, and those ideas fit the evidence well. Yet, the records still leave room for wonder. Why did it begin with one woman on a particular July morning? Why did the music seem to guide rather than stop the motion? Why did the urge fade when it did, without any dramatic intervention? These questions have no final answer, and perhaps that is part of what keeps the event alive in the historical memory. It serves as a gentle warning that human beings remain capable of surprising themselves when conditions align in certain ways. The same vulnerability exists today in different forms, though modern societies have more tools to recognize and ease collective strain before it takes such visible shape. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that communities are stronger when they respond with patience and shared effort rather than fear or force. It also suggests that some aspects of our inner lives will always carry an element of the unexplained, even as knowledge grows. The story of the dancing plague ultimately fits into the larger pattern of human experience across the centuries. It belongs to an age when the world felt both familiar and full of forces beyond easy control. The people who lived through it in Strasbourg went on with their trades, their families, and their devotions. The river kept flowing, the cathedral bells kept ringing, and the city kept its place within the empire. The event left no monuments or annual festivals, only the careful entries in the town ledgers, and the memory passed quietly among neighbors. In that sense, it reflects the steady, unassuming way history often unfolds, not through grand declarations, but through the small adjustments people make when life presents something new and puzzling. The dancers themselves, once the compulsion lifted, returned to the same streets and tasks they had known before, carrying the experience as a private chapter rather than a public legend. Their resilience, and the resilience of the city around them, offers a calm example of how ordinary lives absorb the extraordinary and continue forward. Looking back from a distance of 500 years, the dancing plague appears neither as a bizarre anomaly nor as a cautionary tale of superstition. It stands instead as a clear instance of how shared hardship can find expression in the body and the community, and how that community can meet the challenge with practicality and care. The lasting value of the records lies in their honesty. They show the event as it was puzzling, exhausting, and eventually resolved through time and the city's measured response. In that honesty, the story continues to speak across the centuries. It tells us that human vulnerability is real, and that it can appear in surprising forms. Yet, it also shows that the same human qualities of cooperation and patience can guide a city through the uncertainty. The Rhine still passes the place where the platform once stood, and the market square still fills with daily activity. The archives remain open to those who wish to read the original notes. The dancing plague of 1518 has become part of the quiet background of European history, a reminder that even in moments when the familiar world seems to slip, people find ways to steady themselves and move ahead together. The summer of 1518 feels very far away now, as we sit here together in the quiet. The narrow streets of Strasbourg have long since changed. The wooden platform is gone, and the river flows on with the same steady pace it kept then. All that remains are the careful notes in the archives, and the simple truth that people, when pressed, can surprise themselves in ways no one expects. Yet, they also show us how communities hold together through patience and small, practical acts of care. Sleep will come when it is ready, easy, and unhurried. The world outside your window keeps turning in its ordinary way, and you are safe inside this moment.